In the shadow of collapse amid strikes, budget cuts, and corporate disarray, something wild came from the wreckage of British Leyland. It was a glorious little wedge-shaped sports car that had the soul of a British roadster, but the heart of an American muscle car underneath the bonnet. It was the Triumph TR8. And not only was this car a more modern interpretation of the Shelby Cobra formula, but it would also actually be the last exciting car that Triumph would ever build. The Triumph TR8 officially burst onto the market in 1978. However, this launch didn't have the shock and awe factor that you might have expected it to have, given it being a V8 sports car. Mainly because Triumph had been toying with the idea of building the TR8 since 1972, before the TR7, the car that the TR8 was based on, even came out. From the very beginning, Triumph's engineers knew that the wedge-shaped TR7 was just one half of the story. Even as the car's dramatic silhouette was being sculpted under Harris Mann's direction, plans were already circulating for a V8-powered variant, as a true spiritual successor to the torquey Triumph TR6. The new TR7 platform, though, couldn't really accommodate an inline-six engine dimensionally, so they would have to make do with the V8, which happened to be more compact in terms of overall length thanks to the V-shaped block design compared to the inline-six. Now, fortunately for Triumph, they did actually have a V8 of their own at their disposal, their 3-liter single overhead cam V8. This engine was essentially two Triumph inline fours conjoined together, with the single overhead cam architecture remaining and around 155 horsepower on tap. This engine would have made for a lively choice inside the future TR8. But as it turns out, this motor had a penchant for unreliability. It initially launched in the Triumph Stag, and the response to this engine was so bad that Triumph refused to put it in the TR8. Luckily though, there was another V8 at their disposal that they could borrow from Rover under the British Leyland umbrella, their 3.5-liter pushrod V8, which for those of you who are in the know, that 3.5-liter V8 was actually an updated version of the Buick 215 cubic inch V8, which proved to be very reliable. Triumph ended up building over 100 Rover V8-powered TR7 prototypes to be used by various dealers to test vehicle reliability and performance for an imminent launch. A launch that ended up getting delayed by 5 years. But why? Well, financially, Triumph was in a tough spot. More specifically, that parent organization I mentioned called British Leyland, which owned Triumph and basically every other British car company. This organization was full of mismanagement and bad decisions that just threatened to bring the whole thing crumbling down. Pair this with the 1973 oil crisis, and launching a second TR7 variant with a V8 seemed like a gamble that Triumph couldn't afford to take at this time. So, the TR7 launched first in 1974 and was manufactured for a few years while the TR8 sat on ice until '78, when it finally hit the market. When it did, the TR8 launched almost exclusively in North America, which was the place with the largest affinity for V8s, and it ended up being a bit of a coming home party for that once Buick-built V8 under the hood. Nevertheless, this revised version of the 215 that Rover made was paired with twin Zenith Stromberg carburetors to start in the TR8, and then later models would be fitted with Bosch L-Jetronic fuel injection. This scrappy aluminum V8 delivered between 133 and 148 horsepower depending on the spec, with a solid 170 foot-pounds of torque. But these numbers alone don't tell the whole story. What made the TR8 stand out was the way that it felt on the road. The TR7, with its 2-liter inline-4, always felt a bit underpowered for its chassis, with just 92 horsepower here in the States. But the TR8 pulled way harder from lower in the rev range, delivering broad torque and a muscular exhaust note that gave the lightweight British wedge some much-needed attitude. Now, again, I know what you're thinking. 140 horsepower or so from a V8 may not sound like a lot, but for the late 1970s, it was right up there with the 145 horsepower base V8s that were in the non-Z28 Camaros, and those were 5 liters in displacement. This engine was only 3.5 liters, and it was aluminum, so it was much lower displacement and it had less weight to pull around, which makes it far more impressive. Especially when considered that the TR8 itself weighed about 2,600 pounds, which in the era of big bumper cars was really light. Mated to a slick shifting 5-speed manual gearbox, the TR8 could sprint from 0 to 60 in just over 8 seconds, which was a whole lot better than the TR7, and they could do about 120 miles per hour. Those numbers put it on par with contemporary rivals like the Datsun 280ZX and ahead of many other British roadsters of the same era. While it wasn't a razor-sharp track weapon in stock form, it did have decent road manners that made it enjoyable to hustle through a back road. Underneath, the TR8 may have shared its steel monocoque chassis with the TR7, but Triumph's engineers knew that dropping a 3.5-liter V8 into that engine bay demanded far more than just a new engine cradle. The chassis had to be reinforced to handle the increased torque and weight, and just as crucially, the suspension system needed some heavy reworking to deliver the ride and control expected from a higher-priced model and the extra weight of the V8. Up front, the McPherson struts remained, but the TR8 received different springs and revised dampers to help better cope with the mass of the Rover V8. Heavier duty anti-roll bars and stronger control arms were also fitted to the car to help improve handling, with the extra weight now being transferred through cornering and acceleration. Out back, the TR8 retained the live axle rear end from the TR7, a cost-saving carryover, but it too saw meaningful revisions. The trailing arms were reinforced and the coil springs were changed. Now, this wasn't as refined as a fully independent rear suspension setup, but it was surprisingly capable and compliant, but mainly the real benefit here was that it was so much cheaper to produce with a live axle, although being an inferior design for handling prowess, which was slightly offset by the fact that it had just an 85-inch wheelbase, which meant rotating the TR8 was pretty darn easy. Braking was also upgraded in line with the TR8's performance potential. Larger front disc brakes were fitted, paired with twin piston calipers to offer stronger, more consistent stopping power. The rear drums remained, but the brake bias and master cylinder were recalibrated to match the new weight distribution and to improve overall pedal feel. For all its newfound performance and the promise it carried, the Triumph TR8 was unfortunately never really given a proper chance to succeed. In typical British Leyland fashion, the car that finally arrived was already fighting an uphill battle, not just against competition, but against its own manufacturer's instability. Between 1978 and 1981, Triumph produced somewhere between 2,700 and 2,800 TR8s. Although the most commonly cited verified number is 2,746 units. Compare that to the nearly 115,000 TR7s built, and it becomes clear just how scarce this V8 variant really was. And it gets rarer. Of those TR8s, roughly 400 of them were coupes. The vast majorities were convertibles, which was a direct nod to the American buyer preference at the time. And many of those early coupe models were actually built as TR7 bodies and then later converted during the assembly process, making them even more of a niche car within a niche car. Production overall was erratic. It was interrupted by labor disputes, part shortages, and constant corporate shuffling within British Leyland. The cars were assembled at 3 different facilities over their lifespan, which I'm going to try to pronounce as an American accurately, but if I got them wrong, go ahead and clown me in the comments, I'm fine with it. Those locations were Speke, Canley, and finally Solihull, and each production zone shift came with its own batch of quality control quirks. Early cars, particularly those from the spec plant, often suffered from inconsistent fit and finish, though quality improved significantly after production was moved to Solihull in 1980. Those production struggles for the TR8 were real, and they also had their fair share of dealership troubles too. But this wonderful wedge did find some unexpected glory on the racetrack, thanks to Bob Tullius and the iconic Group 44 racing team. Funny enough, the Triumph TR8 actually dominated in the SCCA B production class of racing. It clinched a national championship in 1980 and regularly outpaced Porsches, Chevrolets, and Datsuns in the same class. And this car's success carried over into the IMSA GT competition, proving that beneath all the corporate missteps and the limited production for the car, there was a solid performance platform underpinning it all. But that 1980 racing series was about the high point of the TR8 story, because by 1981, Triumph could barely keep the lights on, and the TR8 was phased out. After this point, Triumph would never again build another true sports car, which makes the Triumph TR8 the last of the breed. Sure, it wasn't perfect. It had the same level of electrical gremlins and reliability issues as pretty much any period British sports car. But shoehorning a little V8 into this British wedge was undeniably cool in its own right, which is why I felt the TR8 was worthy of making a video on. Hope you all enjoyed and found it to be a fun watch. If you did, it would mean a whole lot if you could like the video and share the video. It really helps me out more than you know. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next one, enthusiasts.